The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered fence posts of the Double R Ranch as Tom Rickman stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. At 72 years old, his body bore the marks of 5 decades working the land. Hands gnarled from rope burns, a permanent squint from years under the harsh Montana sun, and a slight limp from a horse that had thrown him during a particularly bad winter storm in '98. But his eyes, steel blue and sharp as ever, surveyed his domain with the pride of the man who had built something lasting with nothing but determination and sweat. The Double are sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land in the heart of Big Sky country. Tom had purchased the original 2,000 acres with money saved from his time as a rodeo cowboy, back when his knees didn't creak and his back didn't remind him of every bull that had ever thrown him into the dirt. Over the years, he had slowly expanded, buying adjacent parcels whenever they came up for sale, until the Double R became one of the most respected cattle operations in the county. The ranch house itself was a testament to Tom's practical nature, a modest 2-story structure built from local timber, with a wraparound porch that offered views of the rolling hills and the distant peaks of the Rocky Mountains. Behind the house stood the barn, a massive red structure that housed his equipment and served as shelter for his horses during the brutal Montana winters. A network of corrals, storage buildings, and worker quarters completed the compound, all connected by gravel roads that Tom had laid himself over the years. This particular morning in late September carried the crisp promise of winter. The aspen trees that dotted the landscape had begun their annual transformation, their leaves shifting from green to brilliant gold, creating patches of color against the backdrop of evergreen pines. Tom's cattle, a hardy mix of Angus and Hereford, grazed peacefully in the near pasture, their breath visible in the cool morning air. Everything appeared normal, routine even, but Tom couldn't shake a feeling of unease that had been growing stronger over the past few weeks. The first signs of trouble had been subtle. A few missing calves that he had initially attributed to natural predation. Mountain lions and bears were always a concern in this part of Montana. Then came the reports from his neighboring ranchers, men like Jake Morrison and Bill Henderson, who had been working the land almost as long as Tom had. They spoke of livestock disappearing in numbers that seemed unusual, even for the changing seasons when predators typically became more active in preparation for winter. What bothered Tom most were the tracks. He had found them near the north pasture 3 days ago, wolf prints in the soft earth near the creek that ran through his property. But these weren't ordinary wolf tracks. They were larger than any he had seen in his decades of ranching, and there were so many of them that the ground looked like it had been churned by a cattle drive. Tom had knelt beside the creek, running his fingers over the impressions in the mud, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Wolves had been reintroduced to the Yellowstone ecosystem in the 1990s, and over the years, packs had slowly expanded their range throughout Montana. Tom understood the ecological importance of their return, even if it complicated life for ranchers. He had lost the occasional calf to wolf predation over the years, and had learned to accept it as part of doing business in wolf country. But this was different. The sheer number of tracks suggested something far beyond the typical family pack of 6 to 8 animals. That evening, Tom had called his neighbor Jake Morrison, a man whose ranch bordered the Double R to the east. Jake was in his 60s, a no-nonsense rancher who had inherited his land from his father and grandfather before him. When Tom described what he had found, Jake's voice had grown serious. "Tom, I've been seeing the same thing," Jake had said over the phone. "Found tracks all around my south pasture yesterday, and I'm missing 6 head of cattle." "6, Tom? That's not normal predation. That's something else entirely." The two men had agreed to meet the following morning to examine the evidence together. When Jake arrived at the Double R just after sunrise, his weathered face wore an expression of concern that Tom had rarely seen. They rode out to the north pasture on horseback, Tom on his faithful quarter-horse buckshot, Jake on a paint mare named Patches. The horses seemed nervous, their ears constantly swiveling, and their nostrils flaring as if detecting scents that made them uneasy. The creek area told a story that both men found deeply disturbing. The wolf tracks were even more numerous than Tom had initially realized, creating a maze of impressions that extended along the creek bank for nearly half a mile. But it was Jake who noticed something that had escaped Tom's attention the day before. "Look at this," Jake said, dismounting near a cluster of tracks. "These prints aren't just from different wolves. They're from different packs." Tom studied the tracks more carefully. Jake was right. The size variations and gait patterns suggested multiple distinct groups of wolves, far more than any single pack would contain. In his experience, wolf packs were territorial and rarely tolerated the presence of other packs in their hunting grounds. What they were seeing defied everything both men knew about wolf behavior. "There's something else," Jake said grimly, pointing to a series of deep gouges in the bark of a nearby cottonwood tree. Claw marks about 8 feet off the ground. "But look at the spacing between them." Tom examined the marks and felt a chill run down his spine. The claws that had made these gouges were massive, far larger than any wolf he had ever encountered. The spacing between individual claw marks suggested paws of extraordinary size, and the height at which they appeared on the tree indicated animals much larger than typical wolves. As they continued their investigation, the picture became increasingly troubling. They found evidence of a large-scale feeding area near a grove of aspens, scattered bones, patches of dried blood, and ground that had been trampled by dozens of animals. Most disturbing were the remains they discovered. Bones from cattle, but also from deer, elk, and what appeared to be smaller predators like coyotes and mountain lions. "This doesn't make sense," Tom muttered, examining a partially buried cattle skull. "Wolves don't typically prey on other predators, and they certainly don't leave feeding sites like this. It's too exposed, too obvious." Jake nodded, his expression troubled. "It's like they're not afraid of being discovered. Like they don't care who knows they're here." The ride back to the ranch house was conducted in relative silence, both men lost in their own thoughts. Tom's unease was growing into something approaching alarm. In all his years on the land, he had never encountered anything like what they had discovered. The evidence suggested the presence of far more wolves than should exist in the area, animals that were significantly larger than normal, and behavior patterns that contradicted everything known about wolf ecology. That afternoon, Tom made a series of phone calls to local wildlife officials, trying to report what he and Jake had found. The responses were uniformly skeptical. Wolves, he was told, don't form super packs. The animals he was describing were far too large to be wolves. The feeding behavior he reported was inconsistent with known wolf patterns. Each conversation left Tom more frustrated and more certain that the people he was speaking with had never dealt with anything like what was happening on his ranch. Dr. Sarah Chun, a wildlife biologist with the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department, was particularly dismissive when Tom called her office in Helena. "Mr. Rickman," she said in a tone that barely concealed her impatience, "I understand your concerns about predation losses, but what you're describing simply isn't possible. Wolf packs in Montana average 6 to 8 individuals. The largest pack ever documented in the region contained 12 animals. The idea of hundreds of wolves moving together contradicts everything we know about their social structure." "Doctor, I'm not making this up," Tom replied, trying to keep his voice level. "I've been ranching this land for 50 years. I know the difference between normal predation and what I'm seeing now. I'm not suggesting you're making anything up, Mr. Rickman, but large predation events can sometimes appear more dramatic than they actually are. A single pack working efficiently can take down multiple animals in a short period, especially if the livestock are clustered together. What you're interpreting as evidence of a super pack is more likely the work of a normal-sized group operating over several nights." Tom hung up the phone, feeling more isolated than ever. The official response was clear. What he was reporting was impossible, therefore it wasn't happening. But the evidence on his land told a different story, and Tom trusted his own eyes more than any wildlife biologist who had never set foot on the Double R. As evening approached, Tom found himself standing on his porch again, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains. The peaceful scene before him, his cattle grazing contentedly, the horses moving slowly through the near pasture, the golden aspens shimmering in the fading light, seemed at odds with the growing sense of menace he felt. Somewhere out there, in the gathering darkness, something was moving through his land. Something that didn't fit the neat categories of the experts. Something that threatened everything he had spent his life building. The wind picked up as darkness fell, carrying with it the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. Tom remained on the porch long after the stars appeared, listening to the night sounds of his ranch. The usual chorus of crickets, the occasional lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, all the familiar sounds that had provided the soundtrack to his life for decades. But underneath it all, just at the edge of hearing, was something else. a sound that raised the hair on the back of his neck and sent Buckshot and the other horses into nervous movement in their stalls. It started as a low howl, distant and mournful, echoing across the valley from the direction of the north pasture. But as Tom listened, more voices joined the first, until the night air was filled with a chorus unlike anything he had ever heard. Not the simple communication between pack members that he was accustomed to, but something more complex, more organized. The howl seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, creating an acoustic web that encompassed his entire ranch. Tom stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn, where his horses were becoming increasingly agitated. Buckshot, normally the calmest animal on the ranch, was pawing nervously at his stall door, his eyes rolling white with fear. The other horses were equally distressed, their usual evening calm replaced by a nervous energy that spoke of deep, instinctual alarm. "Easy, boy," Tom whispered, reaching out to stroke Buckshot's neck. But the horse shied away from his touch, something that had never happened in all their years together. The howling continued for nearly an hour, rising and falling in waves that seemed to follow some complex pattern. Tom found himself trying to count the individual voices, but gave up when he reached 50 distinct howls. Whatever was out there was far larger than any pack of wolves, and its presence was having an effect on every animal on the ranch. When the howling finally stopped, the silence that followed was even more unsettling than the noise had been. Tom stood in the barn doorway for another hour, listening to the night and trying to convince himself that what he had heard could be explained by normal wolf behavior. But the evidence of his senses told him otherwise. As he finally made his way back to the house, Tom made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would gather his own evidence. He would document what was happening on his land with photographs and video, creating a record that even the skeptical officials couldn't dismiss. Whatever was out there, whatever had invaded his ranch, Tom Rickman was going to prove its existence. He had no way of knowing that his decision to investigate would lead him into a confrontation that would test every skill he had learned in 72 years of life, and that would force him to defend not just his livestock, but his very survival against odds that no one would believe. The battle for the Double R Ranch was about to begin, and Tom Rickman, armed with nothing but his experience and determination, was going to be its sole defender. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Double R Ranch, with clouds hanging low over the mountains like a heavy blanket. Tom had barely slept, his rest interrupted by the sounds of distressed cattle and the nervous whinnying of horses that seemed to sense something predatory moving through the darkness. When he finally gave up on sleep at 5 in the morning, he found his coffee maker already brewing automatically, a small comfort in what was shaping up to be an extraordinarily difficult day. Tom's first stop was the equipment shed, where he gathered his camera, a pair of powerful binoculars, and his grandfather's old Winchester rifle, a weapon he had hoped never to use against wolves, but which now seemed like a necessary precaution. He also loaded his ATV with extra fuel, water, and emergency supplies. If he was going to document whatever was threatening his ranch, he needed to be prepared for a long day in the field. The ride to the north pasture revealed devastation that made Tom's stomach clench with anger and disbelief. Overnight, something had struck his herd with surgical precision and devastating effectiveness. 7 more cattle were missing, including his prized breeding bull, Magnus, a magnificent Angus that had cost him $12,000 and had sired some of the finest calves on the ranch. The areas where the cattle had been taken were marked by clear signs of struggle: churned earth, broken fence posts, and bloodstains that told the story of animals dragged away while still alive. But it was the tracks that truly shocked Tom. The wolf prints from the previous day had been joined by hundreds more, creating a network of trails that crisscrossed his property like a military operation. The prints showed multiple sizes of animals, from what appeared to be standard wolves to creatures whose paw prints were nearly the size of Tom's outstretched hand. Most disturbing was the organization visible in the track patterns. These weren't random predator movements, but coordinated group behavior that suggested intelligence and planning far beyond normal wolf capabilities. Tom began photographing everything methodically, creating a visual record that he hoped would convince the authorities that his ranch was under siege by something unprecedented. As he worked, his camera captured details that were even more unsettling when viewed through the lens. The claw marks on trees weren't just larger than normal. They showed a pattern of deliberate marking, as if the animals were claiming territory and announcing their presence. The feeding areas weren't simply places where kills had been consumed, but organized sites where multiple animals had gathered to share prey in a manner that suggested complex social cooperation. Around mid-morning, Tom heard the rumble of an approaching truck and looked up to see Jake Morrison driving toward him across the pasture, his face grim even from a distance. Behind Jake's truck followed two more vehicles, Bill Henderson's pickup and a white SUV that Tom didn't recognize. "Tom," Jake called out as he climbed from his truck, "we need to talk. This thing is spreading." The man emerging from the white SUV was Dr. Michael Foster, a veterinarian from the town of Clearwater who served several ranches in the area. Dr. Foster was a practical man in his 50s who had seen his share of predation incidents, but his expression as he approached suggested that he was dealing with something outside his normal experience. "Tom, I've spent the last 3 hours examining what's left of Bill's herd, Dr." Foster said without preamble. "I've never seen anything like it. Whatever did this, it wasn't normal predation. The wounds, the kill patterns, the sheer scale of the attack, it defies every model of wolf behavior I know." Bill Henderson looked haggard, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by the hollow expression of a man who had suffered a devastating loss. "They took 47 head in one night, Tom. 47. I've been ranching for 35 years, and I've never lost more than 5 animals to predators in an entire season. Last night, they wiped out nearly a quarter of my herd." The four men spent the next several hours examining the evidence on Tom's property, with Dr. Foster documenting everything with the methodical precision of a scientist confronted with an impossible puzzle. The veterinarian's expertise allowed him to read details in the attack sites that had escaped the rancher's notice. The bite patterns on the few partial remains they found suggested jaw strength far exceeding normal wolf capabilities. The coordination evident in the kill sites indicated pack behavior involving far more animals than should be able to coexist in a single territory. "Look at this," Dr. Foster said, kneeling beside a set of tracks near the creek. "These prints show animals moving in formation, maintaining specific spacing between individuals. This isn't hunting behavior. This is military-style movement, like they're following some kind of tactical plan." Jake shook his head in disbelief. "Wolves don't think tactically, document. They hunt by instinct and opportunity." "That's exactly my point," Dr. Foster replied. "What we're seeing here contradicts everything we know about wolf behavior and biology. Either we're dealing with a completely unknown subspecies, or something has fundamentally altered the behavior of the wolves in this region." As the afternoon progressed, the evidence became increasingly difficult to explain through conventional wildlife biology. The tracks showed animals that seemed to be communicating across vast distances, coordinating movements that spanned multiple ranches simultaneously. The feeding patterns suggested a hierarchy and organization that went far beyond the simple dominant structures typical of wolf packs. Most puzzling were the territorial markings, not just the typical scent marking used by wolves, but elaborate arrangements of stones and branches that seemed designed to convey complex information. Tom documented everything with his camera, building a comprehensive record of what was happening on his land. But as the day wore on, he became increasingly aware that documentation might not be enough. The scale of the losses, the organized nature of the attacks, and the clear intelligence behind the predation patterns suggested that his ranch was under siege by something that wasn't going to be deterred by traditional wildlife management techniques. As evening approached, the four men gathered on Tom's porch to discuss their options. The official response to their reports had been uniformly skeptical, with wildlife officials dismissing their claims as exaggerated accounts of normal predation. The local sheriff's department had no experience dealing with wildlife issues of this magnitude. Federal wildlife agencies were bureaucratic organizations that moved slowly and required extensive documentation before taking action. "We're on our own," Jake said bluntly. "Nobody believes us, and by the time they do, we'll have lost everything." Dr. Foster nodded grimly. "I've called colleagues at the university, shared the photos Tom took today. The response has been uniformly skeptical. What we're describing simply doesn't fit any known models of wolf behavior." Bill Henderson, who had been quietly nursing a cup of coffee, finally spoke up. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the old days, before the government cleared out all the wolves. He claimed that sometimes in the worst winters, the packs would band together into something he called a gathering. Said it happened maybe once in a generation, when conditions were so bad that the wolves had to choose between cooperation and starvation. Tom leaned forward with interest. What did these gatherings do? According to the stories, they would sweep through an entire valley, taking everything they could find. But the old-timers knew how to deal with them. They'd ford up, protect what they could, and wait for the gathering to move on. The thing is, Grandpa always said the gatherings weren't just about food. They were about territory, about establishing dominance over a region. Dr. Foster looked skeptical. Those are folk tales, Bill. There's no scientific evidence that wolves have ever formed super packs of the size you're describing. Maybe not, Bill replied. But there's no scientific evidence for what's happening to us right now, either. Sometimes the old stories carry more truth than the experts want to admit. As darkness fell, the conversation was interrupted by a sound that froze all four men in their tracks. The howling began again, but this time it was closer, more organized, and more numerous than the night before. The voices seemed to surround the ranch house, coming from the north, south, east, and west simultaneously. As they listened, the howls began to follow a pattern. A lead voice that would call, followed by responses from multiple directions, creating a complex acoustic conversation that seemed to coordinate movement across the entire property. Tom's horses became increasingly agitated, their distress clearly audible from the barn. The cattle in the near pasture began moving nervously, clustering together in a defensive formation that spoke of deep, instinctual fear. Even Tom's dogs, normally brave guardians of the ranch, retreated to the porch and pressed themselves against the house, whimpering with terror. "Listen to the pattern," Dr. Foster said quietly. "That's not random vocalization. They're communicating specific information, coordinating their positions." The howling continued for over 2 hours, during which time the four men could see movement in the darkness beyond the ranch lights. Shadows seemed to flow between the buildings, always staying just beyond the reach of illumination, but clearly visible as shapes that moved with purpose and intelligence. At one point, Tom counted at least 30 distinct forms moving past his equipment shed, flowing like water around obstacles and maintaining formation as they traversed his property. "How many do you think there are?" Jake whispered. Tom had been trying to count the individual voices in the howling chorus, but had given up when he reached 100 distinct calls. "More than we can handle with conventional methods," he replied grimly. When the howling finally stopped, the silence was profound and ominous. The four men remained on the porch for another hour, listening to the night and watching for movement, but whatever had been surrounding them had melted back into the darkness as quietly as it had appeared. Dr. Foster was the first to break the silence. "Tom, I think you need to consider evacuation. What we're dealing with here is beyond anything I've encountered, and I don't think it's safe for you to remain isolated on the ranch." But Tom shook his head firmly. "This is my land, document. I've put 50 years of my life into building this place, and I'm not going to be run off by wolves, no matter how many there are or how strange they're acting." Jake and Bill nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting the same stubborn determination that had made them successful ranchers in one of the most challenging environments in America. These were men who had faced blizzards, droughts, economic disasters, and every other challenge that the land could throw at them. They weren't about to be defeated by predators, regardless of how unprecedented the threat might be. "Then, we make a stand," Jake said simply. "We gather our resources, fortify what we can protect, and prepare for whatever's coming next." As his neighbors prepared to leave, Tom began making mental preparations for what he was increasingly certain would be a siege. He had enough ammunition for his rifles to last several days of fighting. His barn and outbuildings could serve as defensive positions. He had fuel for his equipment and enough food and water to last for weeks if necessary. Most importantly, he had the knowledge of his land that came from 5 decades of working every acre of the Double R Ranch. But as he watched the taillights of his friends' vehicles disappear into the darkness, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was preparing for a battle unlike anything he had ever faced. The enemy was intelligent, organized, and far more numerous than anything that should exist in the wild. They had demonstrated the ability to coordinate complex attacks across multiple properties simultaneously, suggesting a level of strategic thinking that challenged every assumption about predator behavior. Standing alone on his porch as midnight approached, Tom Rickman made a silent promise to his land, his cattle, and his horses. Whatever was coming for his ranch would have to go through him first. He had no idea that within hours, that promise would be tested in ways that would push him beyond every limit of endurance and courage he had ever imagined possible. The siege of the Double R Ranch was about to begin. The attack began at 2:47 in the morning, and Tom knew the exact time because he had been watching the clock on his nightstand, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. The first indication of trouble was the absolute silence that fell over the ranch. No cricket chirps, no cattle lowing, no horses moving in their stalls. It was the kind of unnatural quiet that every rancher learns to fear, the silence that precedes disaster. Tom was already reaching for his rifle when the howling started, but this time it wasn't the organized communication he had heard the previous nights. This was something primal and terrifying, the hunting call of predators that had found their prey cornered and helpless. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding the ranch house in a circle of voices that spoke of hunger and violence. Pulling on his boots and grabbing his Winchester, Tom moved to his bedroom window and peered out through the curtains. What he saw made his blood freeze in his veins. The entire yard of his ranch was alive with movement, shadows flowing between the buildings like water, but shadows with eyes that reflected the security lights in points of cold fire. There were dozens of them, moving with the fluid coordination of a military unit, and they were all converging on his livestock. The horses in the barn were screaming in terror, a sound that cut through the howling like a knife. Tom could hear them throwing themselves against their stall doors in panic, and he knew that if he didn't act quickly, he would lose every animal on the ranch. But as he watched the coordinated movement of the pack through his window, he realized that this wasn't random predation. This was a carefully planned assault designed to overwhelm his defenses and destroy his livelihood in a single night. Tom moved quickly through his house, checking windows and doors, making sure everything was secured. His ranch house was built like a fortress, with heavy timber construction and reinforced doors that could withstand Montana winters, but he had never intended them as protection against an organized pack of super predators. As he moved from room to room, he could see wolves moving past every window, not the occasional glimpse of a single animal, but a constant stream of forms that suggested numbers far beyond anything he had imagined. The first direct assault came against the chicken coop, and Tom watched in horror as a coordinated group of 6 massive wolves systematically demolished the structure. They didn't just kill the chickens. They destroyed every element of the coop with a methodical efficiency that spoke of intelligence and planning. Within minutes, the coop was reduced to scattered lumber and feathers, every bird dead or missing. But the chickens were just the beginning. As Tom watched from his living room window, he saw the main pack moving toward the barn where his horses were trapped. The animals he could see clearly in the security lights were enormous. Wolves that stood nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with heads that seemed disproportionately large and jaws that promised devastating bite force. They moved with the confidence of apex predators that had never encountered serious resistance. Tom made a decision that would define the rest of the night. He couldn't save everything, but he could save what mattered most. His horses represented not just economic value, but decades of careful breeding and training. Buckshot alone was worth more than money. He was a partner who had carried Tom through countless days of ranch work, a companion whose trust and loyalty had been earned through years of mutual respect. Grabbing extra ammunition and a powerful flashlight, Tom slipped out his back door and began a dangerous journey across his own property. The wolves had excellent night vision, but they were focused on the barn and hadn't yet posted sentries around the house. Moving from shadow to shadow, using every bit of cover his familiar landscape provided, Tom began working his way toward the barn through what had become enemy territory. The journey that normally took 2 minutes stretched into 20 nerve-wracking minutes of careful movement and frozen waiting. Every few yards, Tom had to stop and let groups of wolves pass by, close enough that he could smell their wild musk and hear their heavy breathing. He counted at least 40 distinct animals during his crossing, and he knew that was just a fraction of the total pack. When Tom finally reached the barn, he found his horses in a state of absolute panic. Buckshot and the other animals were throwing themselves against their stall doors with such force that the heavy wooden barriers were beginning to splinter. The wolves hadn't yet broken into the barn, but they were circling the building like sharks, testing for weak points and working themselves into a feeding frenzy with their continuous howling. Tom knew he had only minutes before the pack found a way into the barn. The building had been designed to keep horses in, not to keep wolves out, and the determined predators would eventually break through the doors or windows. He needed a plan that would save his animals and give him some chance of surviving the night. Looking around the barn, Tom spotted the solution in his emergency equipment. Years of dealing with Montana winters had taught him to prepare for every contingency, and one of his preparations was a set of emergency flares that he kept for signaling during blizzards. The flares burned with intense heat and brilliant light, creating exactly the kind of distraction that might disrupt the wolves' coordination. Tom began setting up a defensive perimeter around the barn, using his knowledge of wolf behavior to create barriers that would funnel the pack into killing zones where his rifle would be most effective. He positioned himself in the hayloft, where he would have clear fields of fire and the high ground advantage that had served military tacticians for centuries. The first wolf to test the barn's defenses was a massive male that appeared at the main door like a gray ghost materializing from the darkness. Tom had never seen a wolf of this size. It stood nearly as tall as a small horse, with a head that seemed too large for even its oversized body. When it looked up toward the hayloft, its eyes reflected Tom's flashlight with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Tom's first shot took the giant wolf center mass, a kill shot that should have dropped any normal animal instantly. Instead, the wolf staggered but remained standing, and its response wasn't retreat, but rage. The howl that erupted from its throat was answered immediately by dozens of voices throughout the ranch, and Tom realized that he had just declared war on an enemy that vastly outnumbered him. The assault on the barn began in earnest within seconds of Tom's first shot. Wolves poured toward the building from every direction, not with the random aggression of maddened animals, but with the coordinated precision of a military unit executing a battle plan. Some attacked the main doors while others circled to find alternative entry points. A group of smaller, faster animals began climbing the exterior walls, using their claws to scale the wooden siding toward the windows of the hayloft. Tom found himself fighting a battle on multiple fronts simultaneously. He moved from window to window in the loft, picking off wolves as they climbed toward him while trying to maintain covering fire for the entrances below. His grandfather's Winchester was performing flawlessly, but Tom was burning through ammunition at an alarming rate, and he knew that he couldn't sustain this level of combat for more than an hour. The wolves showed a disturbing ability to adapt to his tactics in real time. When Tom shot at climbers from the east window, the pack immediately shifted to attack from the west. When he focused fire on the main door, they began concentrating on the loading dock entrance. Most unsettling was their apparent ability to learn from the deaths of pack members. After Tom killed several animals attempting to climb directly up to the loft, the remaining wolves began using indirect approaches that were much harder to defend against. Around 4 in the morning, Tom made a devastating discovery about his enemies. A wolf that he had shot and assumed dead suddenly rose from where it had fallen and rejoined the attack. Then another presumed casualty did the same, and another. Either these animals possessed extraordinary resilience, or Tom's marksmanship was failing under pressure. When he looked more closely through his rifle scope, he realized the truth was even more disturbing. Some of the wounds he had inflicted were healing with supernatural speed. The implications hit Tom like a physical blow. He wasn't fighting normal wolves. Whatever these creatures were, they possessed abilities that defied natural law. But even as that realization threatened to overwhelm him with despair, Tom's rancher instincts kicked in. Supernatural or not, these animals were threatening his livestock and his livelihood. He had faced impossible odds before, droughts that should have destroyed his ranch, economic disasters that should have bankrupted him, personal tragedies that should have broken his spirit. He had survived them all through determination, preparation, and the refusal to quit when things got difficult. Tom began adapting his tactics to match the unnatural resilience of his enemies. Instead of trying for quick kills, he aimed for disabling shots that would slow the wolves down even if they couldn't be permanently stopped. He focused on breaking leg bones and damaging joints, creating injuries that would impair mobility regardless of healing speed. He also began using his emergency flares as weapons, throwing the burning devices into clusters of wolves where their intense heat created chaos and temporary blindness. The battle raged through the darkest hours before dawn, with Tom holding his position in the hayloft against wave after wave of coordinated attacks. His horses remained safe in their stalls below, but the cost of protecting them was enormous. Tom's ammunition was running low, his flares were nearly exhausted, and his body was beginning to show the strain of hours of continuous combat. His hands were shaking from adrenaline and fatigue, his shoulder ached from rifle recoil, and his throat was raw from breathing the acrid smoke of burned flares. But the wolves were paying a price as well. Despite their apparent ability to recover from wounds, they couldn't ignore the damage entirely. The barn was surrounded by dozens of injured animals that moved more slowly than their healthy pack mates. The coordinated attacks were becoming less precise as the pack leadership suffered casualties. Most importantly, Tom sensed a growing frustration among the wolves as their overwhelming numerical advantage failed to produce the quick victory they had expected. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, Tom realized that something was changing in the pack's behavior. The howling was becoming less coordinated, the attacks less focused. Some of the wolves were beginning to withdraw from the immediate vicinity of the barn, melting back into the landscape as if responding to some invisible signal. Tom maintained his vigilant position in the hayloft, but he began to dare to hope that he might actually survive until sunrise. In his experience, most predators avoided exposure during daylight hours, preferring the cover of darkness for their hunting activities. If he could hold out for another hour, he might live to see another day and get the help he desperately needed. But as the sky continued to brighten, Tom made a discovery that chilled him more than anything that had happened during the long night of battle. The wolves weren't retreating because of the approaching dawn. They were regrouping, gathering in the distance where he could see them clearly for the first time as the morning light grew stronger. There weren't dozens of wolves surrounding his ranch. There weren't even 100. As Tom watched through his binoculars, he counted group after group of the massive predators, their gray and black forms creating a living carpet across his pastureland. His rough count reached 200 before he stopped, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what he was seeing. But they weren't retreating. They were simply changing tactics, preparing for a daylight assault that would test every skill Tom had learned in 7 decades of life. The battle for the Double R Ranch was far from over, and Tom Rickman was about to face the greatest challenge of his long and difficult life. Dawn revealed the true magnitude of Tom's situation in stark, unforgiving detail. As the morning sun crested the eastern mountains and cast its light across the Double R Ranch, Tom found himself staring at a sight that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. His 15,000 acres of grazing land were covered with wolves, not scattered individuals or small packs, but an organized army that stretched as far as he could see through his binoculars. From his position in the hayloft, Tom conducted a careful count and reached a number that made his hands shake. Nearly 300 individual animals, arranged in what appeared to be a military formation. The wolves weren't randomly distributed across his property, but organized into distinct groups that maintained specific distances and positions relative to each other. At the center of the formation stood a massive alpha male, easily twice the size of any wolf Tom had ever seen, its silver-gray coat gleaming in the morning sunlight like polished armor. The alpha's behavior was unlike anything documented in wildlife biology textbooks. Instead of the typical dominance displays used by pack leaders, this animal was clearly communicating complex information to its subordinates through a series of howls, body positions, and movements that resembled nothing so much as a general briefing his troops. As Tom watched, groups of wolves would approach the alpha, receive what appeared to be specific instructions, then move off to execute coordinated maneuvers across the ranch landscape. Tom's ammunition situation was becoming critical. He had started the night with over 200 rounds for his Winchester, and now he was down to fewer than 50. His emergency flares were completely exhausted, and his backup supplies were all in the ranch house, which might as well have been on another continent given the distance he would have to travel through hostile territory. Most disturbing was his growing realization that normal hunting ammunition was proving inadequate against these creatures. Even his best shots, which should have been instantly lethal, were only slowing the wolves down temporarily. The horses in the barn below were showing signs of extreme stress that went beyond simple fear. Buckshot, normally the calmest animal on the ranch, was trembling continuously and had developed a glazed look in his eyes that Tom recognized as the onset of shock. The other horses were in similar condition, their psychological state deteriorating as the prolonged siege continued. Tom knew that even if he managed to save their lives, the trauma of this experience might permanently damage their usefulness as working animals. Around 7 in the morning, Tom heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors and felt a surge of hope that help was finally arriving. But as the aircraft came into view, he realized it was a news helicopter, not a rescue operation. Someone had obviously heard reports of unusual wolf activity in the area and had come to investigate. The helicopter circled the ranch at a safe altitude, its cameras no doubt recording the incredible scene below, but it made no attempt to land or provide assistance. The presence of the helicopter seemed to galvanize the wolf pack into immediate action. As if responding to some predetermined signal, the entire formation began moving toward the barn in a coordinated assault that made their previous attacks look like casual probing. This time, there was no testing of defenses or cautious approach. The wolves came in 3 distinct waves, each designed to overwhelm a different aspect of Tom's defensive position. The first wave consisted of the fastest animals, wolves that moved with the speed of racing greyhounds, but possessed the size and power of small horses. Their job was clearly to scale the barn walls and force Tom to divide his attention between multiple climbing attacks simultaneously. Tom found himself in a desperate dance from window to window, picking off climbers just before they reached the loft level, but more kept coming than he could possibly stop. The second wave attacked the barn's structural integrity itself. These were the largest wolves, animals whose size and strength allowed them to systematically destroy the building's defenses. Tom watched in horror as they began tearing apart the main doors with their claws, working together with the coordination of a demolition crew. The heavy timber that had withstood decades of Montana weather was being reduced to kindling by creatures that possessed impossible strength. The third wave was the most terrifying because it demonstrated strategic thinking that went far beyond animal instinct. A group of wolves had positioned themselves upwind of the barn and began howling in a pattern that created a disorienting acoustic effect. The sound wasn't just loud, it was designed to interfere with Tom's ability to concentrate and aim effectively. The frequency and rhythm of their calls seemed to resonate with something primal in his nervous system, creating a fear response that threatened to overwhelm his rational mind. Tom realized that he was facing defeat through attrition. Even if every shot found its mark, he simply didn't have enough ammunition to stop 300 attackers. The wolves could afford massive casualties because their numbers were so overwhelming, while Tom could afford no mistakes at all. It was a mathematical certainty that they would eventually breach his defenses and overrun his position. But Tom Rickman hadn't survived 7 decades in one of America's harshest environments by giving up when the odds turned against him. As the wolves pressed their coordinated attack, Tom began implementing increasingly desperate measures that drew on every resource available in the barn. He used his chainsaw to cut sections of the loft floor, creating kill zones where approaching wolves would fall into the stalls below. He fashioned improvised spears from pitchfork handles, creating weapons for close combat when his ammunition ran out. Most importantly, he began preparing the barn for what amounted to a controlled demolition. Tom's plan was based on his knowledge of his own building's construction and the behavioral patterns he had observed in the wolf pack. The barn was filled with hay, fuel, and other combustible materials that could create a massive fire if ignited properly. The wolves had demonstrated tactical intelligence, but they were still animals with instinctive fear responses. A large enough fire might disrupt their coordination and force them to retreat, at least temporarily. The preparation had to be done while under continuous attack, which made every movement a life-or-death calculation. Tom moved through the loft like a man possessed, spreading gasoline from his emergency supplies, creating fuses from rope and cloth, and positioning accelerants where they would create the maximum psychological impact on the attacking wolves. His hands were bleeding from wounds inflicted by flying splinters as the wolves tore at the barn's exterior, and his ears were ringing from the continuous howling that surrounded the building. As Tom worked, he found himself thinking about his life, his choices, and the ranch that had been his entire world for 50 years. The double R represented more than just land and livestock. It was proof that a man could build something lasting through determination and hard work. Every acre had been fought for, every building constructed with his own hands, every fence post set through back-breaking labor that had earned him the right to call this place home. The wolves were beginning to break through the main doors when Tom completed his preparations and took his position at the detonation point. He had created what amounted to an explosive device using materials available in any ranch barn: gasoline, propane tanks, fertilizer, and various other chemicals that became dangerous when combined properly. The blast wouldn't be large enough to destroy the entire wolf pack, but it would create chaos and fire that might give him a chance to escape to the ranch house. As the first wolves poured through the breached doors and began climbing toward the loft, Tom lit his fuses and began counting down the seconds until detonation. Below him, he could hear his horses screaming in terror as wolves entered their sanctuary, but there was nothing he could do to save them now. His only chance was to create enough disruption to make an escape possible. The explosion, when it came, exceeded even Tom's expectations. The combination of accelerants created a fireball that blew out every window in the barn and sent wolves flying in all directions. The structural damage was catastrophic. Support beams cracked, roof sections collapsed, and the entire building began listing to one side like a ship taking on water. But most importantly, the wolves' coordination was completely disrupted as their assault formation dissolved into chaos. Tom used the confusion to make his escape from the burning barn, running through smoke and flames toward his ranch house while wolves scattered in panic around him. Some of the animals were on fire themselves, rolling in the dirt to extinguish their burning fur, while others fled from the heat and smoke with their tactical discipline completely abandoned. For the first time since the siege began, Tom had gained the initiative through sheer audacity and desperation. But as he reached the safety of his house and barricaded himself inside, Tom knew that his victory was temporary at best. He had saved his own life and disrupted the wolves' attack, but he had also destroyed his own barn and likely killed his horses in the process. The ranch house would provide better protection than the barn, but it couldn't withstand a sustained siege by 300 determined predators. Looking out his living room window at the burning ruins of his barn, Tom saw the wolf pack already beginning to reorganize under the direction of their massive alpha leader. They had learned from this setback, and their next assault would be planned with the knowledge that their human opponent was more dangerous and resourceful than they had initially assumed. The battle for the Double R Ranch was entering its final phase, and Tom Rickman was running out of options for survival. As the morning sun climbed higher into the Montana sky, casting harsh light on the devastation that had once been a peaceful ranch, Tom began preparing for what he knew would be the last stand of his life. He had ammunition for perhaps one more hour of fighting, no escape route that wouldn't expose him to immediate attack, and enemies that had demonstrated the ability to adapt their tactics faster than he could counter them. But he also had something that no amount of tactical intelligence could overcome: the absolute refusal to surrender what he had spent his life building. The wolves might kill him, but they would not drive him from his land. The final assault began at 10 o'clock in the morning, with the Montana sun hanging high in a crystal-clear sky that provided perfect visibility for what Tom knew would be his last battle. From his fortified position in the ranch house, he watched through reinforced windows as the wolf pack completed its reorganization under the direction of the massive alpha that had clearly learned from the barn explosion. This time, there would be no gradual probing or testing of defenses. The wolves were preparing for an overwhelming assault designed to end the siege decisively. Tom had spent the previous hour preparing his house for what amounted to a medieval siege defense. Every window was barricaded with furniture and steel plates salvaged from his workshop. The doors were reinforced with timber braces that could withstand enormous pressure. He had positioned his remaining ammunition strategically throughout the house, creating fallback positions that would allow him to continue fighting even if the wolves breached the main defenses. Most importantly, he had accepted that he probably wasn't going to survive the day, and that acceptance had given him a strange sense of peace. The attack formation the wolves assembled was unlike anything Tom had witnessed during the previous night's battles. Instead of the chaotic rushes and probing attacks they had used before, the pack had organized itself into what could only be described as military units. Fast-moving scouts circled the house at a distance, clearly mapping every possible approach and escape route. Heavy assault teams positioned themselves at each entrance, ready to breach the doors and windows simultaneously. Most unsettling was a reserve force that remained with the alpha leader, ready to exploit whatever breakthrough the initial assault achieved. The helicopters had returned, not just news crews now, but what appeared to be military aircraft maintaining a cautious distance from the ranch. Tom could see additional vehicles on the distant roads, emergency responders, wildlife officials, and curiosity seekers drawn by reports of the unprecedented wolf activity. But none of them were close enough to provide immediate assistance. And Tom knew that by the time help could reach him, the battle would be long over. As the wolves prepared for their final assault, Tom found himself thinking not about death, but about legacy. The Double R Ranch represented 5 generations of his family's work, starting with his great-grandfather who had homesteaded the original section in the 1890s. Every fence post, every water line, every acre of improved pasture carried the sweat and dreams of men who had believed that hard work and determination could build something permanent in an impermanent world. If he was going to die defending this land, at least he would die as his ancestors had lived, fighting for what they had built. The first indication of the final assault was the complete cessation of all sound from the wolf pack. After hours of continuous howling and movement, the sudden silence was more unnerving than any amount of noise had been. Tom moved from window to window, trying to spot the advancing attackers, but the wolves had become invisible, using every bit of cover his own landscape provided to mask their approach. The attack, when it came, was perfectly coordinated across multiple fronts simultaneously. Wolves struck every window and door at exactly the same moment, creating a cacophony of breaking glass and splintering wood that sounded like the ranch house was being torn apart by a tornado. Tom found himself in the fight of his life, moving from position to position as his defenses were systematically overwhelmed by the sheer number of attackers. But something extraordinary happened as the battle reached its crescendo. The news helicopters that had been circling at a safe distance suddenly descended much lower, their cameras capturing every detail of Tom's desperate last stand. The footage was being broadcast live to television stations across the country, and the response was immediate and unprecedented. Social media exploded with images of the elderly rancher fighting for his life against impossible odds, and the public reaction was volcanic. Within minutes of the live footage hitting the internet, emergency response coordinators were receiving thousands of phone calls demanding immediate action to save Tom Rickman. Local law enforcement agencies found themselves overwhelmed by citizens volunteering to help with a rescue operation. Most importantly, military commanders who had been watching the situation with detached professional interest suddenly found themselves under enormous political pressure to intervene before the elderly cowboy was killed on live television. But Tom knew nothing of the outside response as he fought room by room through his own house. The wolves had breached his outer defenses and were systematically clearing each room with the efficiency of a special operations team. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, his improvised weapons were breaking under the strain of continuous combat, and his 72-year-old body was reaching the limits of its endurance. As he made his final retreat to his bedroom, Tom prepared to make his last stand with nothing more than his grandfather's hunting knife and the stubborn refusal to die easily. The massive alpha wolf that finally cornered Tom in his bedroom was unlike any animal he had ever encountered. Standing nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, with muscles that rippled beneath its silver gray coat and eyes that held an intelligence that was deeply disturbing, the creature seemed more like a mythological beast than any natural predator. When it spoke, and Tom was certain that it actually spoke in a voice like grinding stone, the words were in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. "You fought well, old man," the alpha said, its voice carrying undertones of respect mixed with predatory hunger. "Your land is strong. Your spirit is strong. We will remember this when we claim what you have built." Tom raised his knife, knowing it was futile but refusing to submit. "This is my land," he said simply. "You'll have to kill me for it." The alpha nodded, as if expecting no other response. That was always the only way this could end. But before the final confrontation could be resolved, the sound of helicopter rotors filled the air, not the distant observers that had been circling for hours, but the heavy beating of military aircraft coming in fast and low. The alpha's head snapped toward the window, its ears pricked forward with sudden alertness. For the first time since the siege began, Tom heard uncertainty in the howling of the pack outside. The rescue operation that descended on the Double R Ranch was coordinated by the Montana National Guard, but it involved resources drawn from across the region. Helicopter gunships provided covering fire, while transport helicopters landed assault teams equipped with everything from tranquilizer weapons to high-powered rifles. Wildlife experts, veterinarians, and emergency medical personnel all converged on the ranch simultaneously, creating a response that was probably excessive for a normal predator situation, but entirely appropriate for what they actually found. The wolf pack's response to the military intervention revealed the final secret of their nature. Instead of scattering like normal animals confronted with overwhelming force, they began a coordinated tactical withdrawal that demonstrated battlefield discipline equal to any human unit. The Alpha's howled commands were answered immediately by every member of the pack, and within minutes the entire formation was moving away from the ranch in perfect order, carrying their wounded and maintaining defensive positions that protected their retreat. Tom was found in his bedroom, still holding his knife and standing over the bodies of 3 wolves that had died, trying to reach him. He was covered in blood, most of it from his attackers, and his house looked like a war zone, but he was alive and conscious. The first words he spoke to his rescuers were not about his injuries or his narrow escape, but about his horses. "Did any of them make it?" he asked, referring to the animals trapped in the burning barn. The answer was both tragic and miraculous. The barn fire had killed most of his horses, but Buckshot and 2 Mares had survived by taking shelter in the concrete storm cellar that connected to the barn's foundation. They were traumatized and injured, but alive, and their survival seemed to give Tom more satisfaction than his own rescue. The aftermath of the siege of the Double R Ranch created a media sensation that lasted for months. The live footage of Tom's last stand became one of the most watched videos in internet history, turning the elderly rancher into an unlikely hero whose courage resonated with people around the world. Wildlife biologists descended on the ranch to study the evidence of the unprecedented wolf behavior, but they found only normal tracks and normal wolf sign that provided no explanation for what hundreds of witnesses had seen. The official investigation concluded that the incident involved an unusually large pack of wolves whose behavior had been altered by some combination of environmental factors, possibly including disease, unusual weather patterns, and human encroachment on their traditional territory. The massive size and extraordinary intelligence reported by witnesses was attributed to the stress and confusion of the situation, despite the clear video evidence that supported Tom's account. Tom himself refused all interviews and media appearances, preferring to focus on rebuilding his ranch and caring for his surviving animals. When pressed by reporters about the supernatural aspects of his experience, he would only say that he had faced wolves, fought them off, and survived to tell about it. The details, he insisted, were nobody's business but his own. But to those who knew him well, Tom was a changed man. His neighbors noticed that he never spoke about the night of the siege, without his eyes taking on a distant look, as if he were remembering something that went beyond normal human experience. He rebuilt his barn exactly where the old one had stood, but he also installed security systems and emergency communications equipment that seemed excessive for normal ranch operations. Most telling was Tom's response to questions about retirement. Before the siege, he had been considering selling the Double R and moving to town, acknowledging that his advancing age made the physical demands of ranching increasingly difficult. After the siege, the suggestion of leaving his land seemed to offend him on a fundamental level. "This is where I belong," he would say when the subject arose. "This is where I'll stay until they carry me out." On clear nights, when the wind was right and the moon was dark, Tom would sometimes stand on his porch and listen to the distant howling of wolves in the mountains. The sounds were normal now, the simple communication between pack members that he had known all his life. But sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, he thought he could detect something else. A deeper voice, more complex than any wolf should possess, calling from the wilderness with a message he could almost but not quite understand. The message seemed to say that the battle for the Double R Ranch had been won, but the war was not over. That somewhere in the vast wilderness of Montana, the pack was waiting, growing stronger, and planning for the day when they would return to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. But Tom Rickman was waiting too, on his 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, with his rebuilt barn and his surviving horses and his absolute refusal to be driven from the land his family had worked for 5 generations. He had faced 300 wolves and lived to tell about it. Whatever came next, he would be ready. The Double R Ranch remained in the Rickman family, as it always had and always would, defended by a man who had learned that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the odds. And if the wolves came again, they would find Tom Rickman waiting for them, just as determined and just as stubborn as he had been on the night that proved that courage and determination could triumph over any odds, no matter how impossible they might seem.